Okay, so we are going to just go through a few tips for the final exam, and also I'm going to give you some example questions for what each section will be like, just to help ease your mind and also to help you better prepare for the test. Okay, so here are some tips that I'd like you to think about. Some of these might seem common sense, but a lot of people don't think about them. And if you haven't taken a large exam like a final exam before, then these might not be things that you have thought about. So first of all, please bring extra pencils and erasers so that you don't have to waste time getting up to sharpen your pencil or asking for supplies. Also, I can't stress it enough, tackle the sections of the exam first that you feel like you know really well, because that's going to give you some confidence and that's going to help you to really get through a lot of the questions quickly at the front end of the exam, and then come back to the ones that are harder for you later. Because if you start out with a hard section and you get confused, then you're going to be a little bit overwhelmed and anxious. So save those parts for last. Make sure that you are double checking that you're on the right number on your Scantron sheet every time you fill in a bubble. It might take you an extra half second, but at the same time, it could save you a lot of time, and it could prevent you from missing a whole bunch of them just from being on the wrong number when you fill in the bubble. Also, cross out any answers that you have already used on the actual test. So what I mean by that is if you have a big word bank or a matching section, just cross out the ones that you are using as you use them so you don't accidentally use some twice, or so that you don't forget about using one. And don't waste time erasing stuff off of the final. Ain't nobody got time for that when you have 200 questions to do in 75 minutes. And I made enough copies so that you don't have to erase. Prepare beforehand by studying thoroughly, which means that you should be studying now, a little bit every day. You can't cram for the test the night before and feel confident and rested enough to get through it well. Make sure, speaking of which, that you get a good night's rest the night before the test, so please don't stay up late studying because your brain's not going to be able to work as well as it normally would. Eat a healthy breakfast. Even if you're not a breakfast person, bring some snacks, because if you're hungry, you won't be able to focus. Also, some people like to bring a fidget or a stress relief ball because they just need to release some energy. And last, I would say pace yourself. So every 15 minutes, you should be through an additional 40 questions. So just keep an eye on the clock, and that way you'll be able to tell whether or not you're working at a quick enough pace. Okay, so part one of the test is about fictional terms. It's 24 questions, and this part you're going to have a word bank at the top. All the words are in a word bank, and you have to fill in the blank. So like this is an example from the test. A smaller story within a larger story, such as that of Juliet's and Paris's betrothal, is known as a or an blank. So hopefully the answer to this one would come quickly to you, that it's a subplot. It's a smaller story within a larger story, and so that would be the correct answer. And this is how it would also help you to be able to apply these fictional terms that are on your study guide to Romeo and Juliet, because some of them are set up like this, where it gives you part of the definition of the term, and then it also gives you an example from the play. I know that we talked about a lot of those fictional terms with the short story unit first 9 weeks, but it's been a long time since we've read those, so we're applying them to something you've read more recently for the purpose of the exam. Okay, so part two is over Romeo and Juliet literary terms, and there are 35 questions for this part. Again, you have a word bank. This one's a little bit different though, because you will use all of the words in the word bank, but some of them will be used more than one time. So this one is from toward the beginning of the play, which is why I put it on the review here, because we haven't talked about this example in a while. She acts as a midwife to the fairies, and she is no bigger than a large jeweled ring on the forefinger of a city councilman, pulled by a team of tiny creatures astride the noses of men as they sleep. Her wagon spokes are made of long spiders' legs. The wagon's cover is made of grasshoppers' wings. So this is Mercutio, and he's describing Queen Mab. And so anytime you're talking about description in a story, detailed description, the answer is what? If you are thinking imagery, then that would be the right answer for this portion. I will tell you, when I was looking back through the tests, there's a lot of examples of hyperboles on there. So when you're taking a test, make sure that you're using hyperbole more than one time. And make sure you go back through, because every example that's on the test would be an example that we pointed out in class, talked about in class, and that was on your reading guide, or either the unit test or the Act 1 or Act 2 quiz. Okay, so part 3 is over the fancy plot terms, and you have to identify those plot terms as they relate to Romeo and Juliet. You have all of these terms on your study guide for finals. This is an example of one of the questions on this matching section. The audience expects Romeo to be a valiant character who makes the right choices and rescues Juliet from having to marry Paris. But since he is so rash and fickle, he doesn't live up to our expectations. So there's a couple different terms that you could apply to Romeo based on this description. Mainly anti-hero or tragic hero. And only one of those would be the choice on the test. So as long as you understand, for example, what an archetype is, what a stock character is, as long as you know those definitions, and especially like for archetype, know the subcategories of archetypes that we talked about during the short story unit, you'll be fine for this section. Another thing that you want to review carefully is the difference between direct and indirect characterization, because I have an example of direct characterization about a character from the play on the test, and then I also have an example of indirect characterization about a character from the play, and that's in the same matching section. Okay, part 4. This is reading strategies, which these are not difficult. However, we haven't discussed them in detail and covered notes over them since the beginning of the semester. So for that reason, it'll be really important for you to review them. Also, just a reminder, all of the video lectures and notes over all of these reading strategies are still on Haiku. So if you come up to any of them on the study guide that you can't remember, please refer to Haiku, because that is going to be the information that you need to know for the final. So here are 3 example questions from the test. Readers should never just passively blank everything they read as facts. It is our job to critically analyze everything we read, thinking for ourselves. So what we talked about in reference to this question is that we should not just passively accept everything that we read, because we need to be analytical, critical thinkers who are evaluating and deeply thinking about what people are telling us, so that we can be intelligent, productive citizens. Okay, the second one, blank is when readers look at all of the text features before actually reading the text in order to gather information that will help them stay focused on their reading. Okay, so for this one, before you are going to read the text, we did this with the short stories that we read, we made predictions. But before we made predictions, we previewed the stories. So previewing is when readers are looking at all the text features before actually reading the text. So remember, we read the information about the author, we looked at the title, we looked at the footnotes and the margins and the pictures and the captions, and based off that information and prior knowledge, we made predictions about the story. The third question there is all the elements of a text other than the article or story itself, such as the author information, the title, any headings, the pictures and captions, and any charts, tables, are called blank. Hopefully you can get this one, if not from remembering it from first 9 weeks, then from what I just told you, which is that those are called text features. So every feature that is there to accompany and complement the text and give readers more information is called a text feature. Okay, so then parts 5 and 6 are over grammar. You have some definitions and then some application of those terms. This is a big chunk of the 200 question final. It's 56 questions, so it's about 1/4 of the final. There are 3 example questions and then one on the next slide too. So the first one is a word that begins a dependent clause that functions as an adjective. Often it is the subject of the dependent clause. Okay, this is a definition. So for this term, you would want to say that this is a relative pronoun. Okay, that's the answer, and this is a matching section. Number 2, we studied the impressive author Shakespeare. So there's a section where you have to identify the part of speech that is underlined. So the word impressive is what? It's describing the author, which is a noun. Hopefully you remember that adjectives describe nouns and pronouns. So impressive is an adjective. And then third, which of the following is not a common conjunctive adverb? You have a list of conjunctive adverbs in your interactive notebooks. You memorized your subordinating conjunctions and relative pronouns, and you should know what most other parts of speech are, including prepositions. So if we were to look at the answers, A is indeed, B consequently, C although, D furthermore, and E thus, the answer would be C. Although is a subordinating conjunction, it is not a common conjunctive adverb. And on one of your assignments, we even worked on understanding that although should not be used as a transition or as a conjunctive adverb. Okay, so a few more questions here related to grammar. What type of sentence is the following? To escape the grip of a crocodile's jaw, push your thumb into its eyeball. So what we have here is just, well, I'll give you time to think about it, but if you look at it, how many independent clauses are there and how many dependent? For some of you, the comma is going to throw you off. The answer would be it's just simple, because push your thumb into its eyeball is just one simple main clause, and then to escape the grip of a crocodile's jaw is what we call an infinitive phrase. It's an infinitive. It doesn't have a subject and a verb. It doesn't start with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun. So if it's only one independent clause, then that's a simple sentence. Another one, what is the following group of words? Before the test. Before you hurry up and say, oh, that's a dependent clause, you need to look to make sure, after that subordinating conjunction, is there a subject and a verb? No, there's not. So if there's no subject and verb, then it's just a phrase. That's the difference between a clause and a phrase. A phrase doesn't have a subject and a verb, but a clause does. And then the third one, which of the following demonstrates correct punctuation of a complex sentence? There are some questions on the final where you have to identify which sentence is the complex sentence, and then there are some where you have to identify whether or not the sentence is punctuated correctly, and that's true for all 4 sentence types as far as the final is concerned. So here you have to remember the 3 rules for dependent clauses. So remember, if it's a subordinate clause that starts the sentence, it needs a comma after it. If it's a subordinate clause later on in the sentence, it doesn't need a comma. But if it's a relative clause, the commas would depend on whether or not the information in the clause is essential to understand the sentence. And if that information is necessary, you do not put commas around it. So look at the example or the answers here. The first one has no commas. The second one has a comma before after. The third one has a comma before and after. And the fourth one has a semicolon. And the last one says none of the above. And the correct answer for this is A, because after he called her an inappropriate name is a dependent clause, and it is on the second half of the sentence. You don't put a comma before it. The semicolon would be incorrect because if you put a semicolon before the dependent clause, then you don't have something that can stand alone on both sides of that semicolon. Okay, part 7 is Romeo and Juliet vocabulary. There will be 13 questions for this part, and it is multiple choice. So this is an example of one of the questions. Reassuringly, Juliet says to Romeo, "I'll prove more true than those who have more blank to be strange." Okay, so if you go through and you remember what the definitions of each of those words are, and if you have any context or understanding of the context of this quote, the answer would be E, who have more cunning to be strange. Okay, and this is the part where she's talking about how she wishes that she would not have revealed who she was to him when he was creeping on her below the balcony, because she was pouring out her emotions and she didn't know that he was listening. Okay, part 8, you have book club genres, and this is 15 questions. So all this stuff is going to come from those guided notes and the notes in your interactive notebook. Remember, there was one day when Mrs. Nelson came and she talked to us about banned books. A lot of the questions also come from those notes specifically. So, 3 of the questions. If something is blank, it challenges society's accepted standards of decency or modesty. So, you might remember that there's 2 different choices that could fit here, obscene or offensive, but there's a difference between those 2, so make sure that you distinguish between those definitions. We're not just talking about something that is offensive here, we're talking about something that is obscene. If it challenges society's expectations of what is modest and decent, then that would be obscene. The second one, blank requires that libraries hand over records of what people have checked out upon government's request or risk being arrested if they don't cooperate. That is known as the Patriot Act. So that was from those banned book notes too. And the third one, blank is a genre of fiction that commonly uses magic and other supernatural phenomena as a primary element of plot, theme, or setting. So this one, you can probably narrow it down to fantasy or sci-fi, and then we have some pretty easy to understand, I think they're yellow guided notes I gave you for this section that clearly distinguishes between the 2 genres, and if it's something that's using magic and supernatural elements, then it would be fantasy. Okay, so then the last part of the test is research skills and MLA, and this is one of the more difficult parts as far as like understanding the concepts of how to cite sources. However, we just finished writing that big research paper and we took a long time to do it. You do have 4 different videos that you watched with 4 different sets of guided notes that you can review, but I'm hoping it's fresh in your mind, and I'm hoping you also go through your final drafts of your essay and look at all the comments that I made, so that if you did make any mistakes or were confused about any of this stuff, that it will be clear to you what you were supposed to do before you take the final. And if there's anything that's confusing, please come and see me, because this is important. As soon as we get back from Christmas break, we'll be starting another research paper. Okay, so this question, which of the following examples correctly demonstrates where to put a period in a directly quoted citation? So you have to look and see. First of all, A, B, C, D, and E, I'm just looking to see all of those have commas before the quote, which is good. You want to have that. A has a period inside the quotations and not after the citation. B has a period inside the quotes and after the citation. C has a period outside of the quotes before the citation. D has a period inside the citation. And E has a period after the citation. So which one's the right answer? If you're thinking E is an elephant, you're right. Look at that one very carefully. That is exactly how a correctly punctuated direct quote should look. Okay, and then another example for MLA and research from the test. In-text citations include A, the author's last name and page number, B, the title of the article and the author's name, C, the URL and the author's name. D, a shortened version of the title and the page number. E, either A or D, depending on whether or not there's an author, or AB, which would be B or C, depending on whether or not there is a title. Hopefully by now, everybody understands that the answer is E. If there's an author, that's what you put in there. And then if there's not an author, you put a shortened version of the title of the article, still using the page number as long as there is one. I had a lot of people, even in the final draft of the essay, who were putting the title of the article instead of the author's last name, or the title of the article and the author's last name. So you would only put the title of the article if there is no author. Okay, and that concludes the final exam review. I feel like I've pretty thoroughly gone through everything that you need to know for the test. So if you have any other questions, or if you're stumped about anything and you can't find the information that you need on haiku, please come see me, and I will help you as much as I can.